There is a specific tone of voice, a specific quality of calm, that an avoidant learns to fear more than any raised voice or tearful confrontation ever could. It's the tone that arrives not from anger, but from exhaustion, the flat, steady sound of someone who has simply stopped fighting because there's nothing left to fight for. Most avoidants have grown almost comfortable navigating conflict, have developed entire strategies for managing tears, managing accusations, managing the intensity of someone still invested enough to be upset. What very few of them have a strategy for is the moment someone stops being upset altogether, the moment frustration gives way not to escalation, but to quiet, final withdrawal of effort. That shift, subtle as it often is, registers somewhere deep in the avoidant's nervous system as something entirely different from every previous conflict, and what follows tends to look nothing like what they expected. If the listener has recently reached this exact point, the point where fighting for understanding finally gave way to simply being done, and has wondered whether the avoidant even noticed the shift, this exploration is going to walk through exactly what tends to happen once they do, and why it so rarely unfolds the way either person initially expects. To understand why this particular shift lands so differently than ordinary frustration, it helps to understand what frustration itself has typically meant to the avoidant throughout the relationship. Frustration, anger, tears, all of these emotional expressions, however uncomfortable, carry an implicit message the avoidant has learned to recognize and, in a strange way, rely on. Continued investment. Someone who is still frustrated is still hoping. Someone who is still upset is still trying to be understood, still believes the relationship is worth the discomfort of confrontation. This means, paradoxically, that an avoidant partner often experiences ordinary conflict as more tolerable than it might seem from the outside, because underneath the discomfort of being confronted lies the quiet reassurance that the other person hasn't yet given up. This is precisely what makes exhaustion so much more destabilizing than anger ever manages to be. Exhaustion doesn't carry that same implicit reassurance. When someone shifts from frustrated engagement to quiet, weary disengagement, the message being communicated changes entirely from "this still matters enough to fight about" to something closer to "I no longer expect this to change." An avoidant partner, attuned as they often are to subtle shifts in another person's emotional investment, even while remaining poor at managing their own, tends to register this change quickly, even if they can't immediately articulate what specifically feels different about the dynamic. It's worth pausing here to speak directly to the listener who has reached this point, wondering whether becoming quietly done, rather than continuing to fight or explain, somehow represents giving up too easily. It doesn't. Reaching genuine exhaustion after sustained, repeated effort isn't a failure of patience. It's what naturally happens when patience meets a pattern that consistently fails to respond to it. The shift from fighting to being done isn't a smaller, weaker version of caring. It's often the final, most honest form that caring takes once every other form has already been tried and has already failed to produce change. There's a specific psychological mechanism worth exploring here, because it explains why this shift so often triggers a reaction in the avoidant that looks almost like the opposite of relief, despite conflict technically decreasing. Avoidant defenses are built primarily to manage closeness, to create distance from intensity that feels overwhelming. They are considerably less equipped to manage the specific discomfort of loss that arrives without any accompanying conflict to focus on or defend against. Anger gives the avoidant something concrete to respond to, something to counter, deflect, or wait out. Quiet exhaustion gives them nothing to grab onto, no argument to win or lose, simply the growing, undeniable sense that something significant has already ended, whether or not either person has said so directly. This absence of something to respond to often produces a specific kind of internal panic that avoidants rarely display outwardly, at least not immediately. Because their entire relational strategy depends on maintaining some degree of control over the pace and terms of closeness, encountering a partner who has stopped actively engaging removes exactly the control they've relied on throughout the relationship. There's no longer a conversation to manage, no longer an argument to strategically de-escalate, no longer visible investment to reassure or manipulate back into calm. What remains instead is simply the quiet, unmanaged fact of someone pulling back their energy entirely. And this fact doesn't respond to any of the avoidant's usual tools. It's worth exploring what specifically happens once an avoidant partner registers this shift, because the initial response often looks confusingly similar to increased effort, at least superficially. Many avoidants, upon sensing genuine exhaustion rather than ordinary frustration, suddenly become more available than they've been throughout the relationship, initiating conversations they previously avoided, offering reassurance they'd previously withheld, sometimes even naming specific behaviours they'd never acknowledged before as problematic. This shift can feel, to the person on the receiving end, like exactly the response they'd been hoping for all along, evidence that being upset simply wasn't enough, that only genuine exhaustion could finally produce real engagement. This is worth examining carefully because the timing and motivation behind this sudden availability matters enormously for understanding what it actually represents. Increased engagement that arrives specifically in response to someone else's exhaustion, rather than arising from independent internal reflection, often has less to do with genuine change and more to do with panic at losing control over the relationship's trajectory. This doesn't mean the engagement is entirely insincere, but it does mean it frequently lacks the deeper, more sustained internal shift that produces lasting behavioural change. It's reactive rather than reflective, motivated by fear of loss rather than genuine reckoning with the patterns that produce the exhaustion in the first place. There's something worth naming directly here for the listener who has experienced exactly this dynamic. Watching an avoidant partner suddenly become remarkably present the moment genuine exhaustion set in, after months or years of remaining unmoved by direct requests for exactly that presence. This experience often produces a specific, painful confusion, wondering why it took reaching the absolute end of patience to finally produce the response that had been asked for all along, sometimes for a very long time, through much gentler and more patient means. It's worth acknowledging honestly that this confusion is warranted. There is something genuinely unfair about a dynamic where sustained, reasonable requests fail to produce change, while exhaustion and withdrawal succeed where patience alone could not. This unfairness doesn't reflect anything wrong with the person who was patient. It reflects something specific about how avoidant psychology tends to respond more readily to consequence than to communication. It's worth exploring what tends to happen next, because the trajectory from this point varies considerably, depending on whether the avoidant's sudden engagement reflects genuine internal shift or simply panic-driven reaction aimed at preventing loss. In cases where panic drives the response, the increased engagement often proves difficult to sustain once the immediate threat of loss subsides, once the other person's exhaustion softens slightly in response to renewed attention, allowing the avoidant's usual defences to gradually reassert themselves. This produces a familiar and painful cycle, engagement rising in response to threatened loss, then receding again once that threat feels sufficiently managed, only for exhaustion to eventually return, sometimes even more depleted than before, having been temporarily raised and then disappointed once again. This cycle deserves careful, honest naming, because recognizing it can help the listener understand a pattern that might otherwise feel confusing or self-doubting to notice. If a similar cycle has repeated more than once, each instance of exhaustion producing temporary engagement that eventually fades back into the same old patterns, this repetition itself carries important information. It suggests that the underlying issue was never really about needing to reach a certain threshold of exhaustion in order to finally communicate clearly enough. The communication was likely already clear, possibly for a long time. What was missing wasn't clarity of message, but a partner capable of sustaining change independent of the immediate pressure created by fear of loss. It's worth examining what genuine change, as opposed to panic-driven reaction, actually tends to look like in contrast, because the distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to assess whether renewed engagement following their own exhaustion represents something durable or something temporary. Genuine change tends to persist even after the immediate crisis has passed, continuing not because the relationship's survival currently depends on it, but because something has genuinely shifted in how the avoidant partner understands their own patterns. It tends to be accompanied by specific, concrete acknowledgement of past behaviour, rather than vague reassurance, and it tends to hold up under the ordinary, undramatic conditions of daily life, not just during the heightened emotional intensity immediately following a moment of crisis. Panic-driven reaction, by contrast, tends to fade as soon as daily life returns to its ordinary rhythm, reverting to old patterns once the acute threat of loss no longer feels immediate. There's a particular kind of clarity available to the listener who reaches this point of genuine exhaustion and then observes carefully what happens next. Because the response, whatever it turns out to be, tends to reveal something important that months of patient communication may have failed to make clear. If genuine reflection and sustained change follow, this suggests the relationship may have simply needed a decisive shift in dynamic in order to finally break through defences that ordinary patience alone couldn't reach. If, instead, the pattern of temporary engagement followed by eventual reversion repeats itself, this suggests something more sobering, that the relationship's fundamental capacity for growth may have already been thoroughly tested and found wanting, regardless of how many additional opportunities get extended going forward. It's worth naming something important here about what exhaustion itself represents, beyond its immediate effect on the avoidant partner's behaviour. Reaching genuine exhaustion after sustained effort is not a failure state to feel ashamed of or to try to reverse through renewed patience. It's information, gathered honestly through direct experience, about what a specific relationship has and hasn't been able to produce despite considerable investment. Honouring that information, rather than talking oneself back into renewed patience simply because the avoidant's temporary engagement felt encouraging, matters enormously for protecting against a cycle that, left unaddressed, tends to repeat indefinitely, each round of exhaustion followed by temporary relief, followed eventually by exhaustion returning, deeper and more depleted than before. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here, concerning what happens inside the avoidant's own body and mind in the moments immediately following their recognition of this shift. Because the internal experience often differs significantly from what shows up externally. Many avoidants report, in retrospect or during therapy, a distinct physical sensation accompanying this specific realization, something closer to a sudden drop in the stomach than to ordinary sadness. A visceral jolt that registers before conscious thought has time to catch up and explain what's happening. This physical response makes sense once understood through the lens of threat detection rather than ordinary emotional processing. The avoidance nervous system isn't simply processing disappointment. It's registering the sudden, unexpected loss of a safety mechanism it had been relying on without fully realizing it. The reliable presence of someone whose continued investment functioned, however unconsciously, as a kind of anchor against the avoidant's own deepest fears about being truly alone. It's worth examining how this recognition tends to interact with an avoidant's characteristic difficulty distinguishing between different types of discomfort, because this difficulty often produces confusing, even contradictory behaviour in the immediate aftermath. Some avoidants misread this specific anxiety as renewed romantic longing, becoming convinced, at least temporarily, that they've suddenly rediscovered deep feelings that had somehow gone dormant throughout the relationship. This misreading, while understandable given how disorienting the underlying sensation actually is, often leads to declarations or gestures that feel, to the person receiving them, both too sudden and somehow hollow, sincere in the moment, but disconnected from any deeper, sustained understanding of what actually needs to change. Other avoidants, more attuned to the actual nature of the anxiety, correctly identify it as fear rather than love, but struggle to communicate this distinction honestly, defaulting instead to the more socially acceptable language of romantic feeling, because naming pure fear of loss feels too exposing to voice directly. There's something worth naming about how this entire dynamic plays out differently depending on how much external support the exhausted partner has cultivated outside the relationship itself, because this factor significantly shapes how the avoidance response, whatever form it takes, actually gets received and processed. A partner who has spent the relationship increasingly isolated, whose friendships and independent sense of identity have narrowed considerably in service of managing the relationship's difficulties, often finds themselves more vulnerable to being pulled back in by the avoidant's sudden, renewed engagement, simply because there's less of an independent foundation to fall back on if that engagement eventually proves temporary. A partner who has maintained a rich, independent life throughout the relationship's difficulties tends to evaluate the avoidance response with considerably more clarity, less urgently in need of the relief that renewed engagement provides, and therefore better positioned to accurately assess whether what's being offered represents genuine change or simply another cycle of temporary reassurance. It's worth exploring too how time itself functions as one of the most reliable tools available for distinguishing genuine change from panic-driven reaction, because the two are often genuinely indistinguishable in the first days or weeks following this kind of shift. Panic produces real, sometimes remarkably convincing behavior in the short term, behavior that can look, feel, and even function identically to authentic change for a limited period. What eventually separates the two is sustainability under ordinary conditions. Once the acute crisis that produced the initial reaction has fully passed and daily life has resumed its normal rhythm. This means patience, ironically, still has a role to play even after reaching the point of exhaustion, not patience in the sense of continuing to tolerate unchanged behavior, but patience in the sense of allowing enough time to pass that the avoidance response can be evaluated honestly, based on what it actually produces over months, rather than what it initially promises in the immediate, heightened aftermath of crisis. There's a particular pattern worth naming here regarding how avoidants often attempt to accelerate this evaluation process, whether consciously or not, by requesting immediate forgiveness or immediate return to how things were before the exhaustion set in. This request, however sincerely intended, often reflects the same underlying pattern that produced the original exhaustion in the first place. A preference for resolving discomfort quickly rather than sitting with the slower, more uncertain process genuine repair actually requires. A partner who has reached genuine exhaustion is under no obligation to provide immediate reassurance simply because the avoidant has finally offered the engagement that was previously missing. Taking time to observe rather than rushing to resolve the discomfort of uncertainty on the avoidant's behalf often serves the relationship's actual long-term health considerably better than immediate reconciliation would, even when immediate reconciliation feels, in the moment, like the kinder or more generous option. It's worth naming as well something important about what genuine accountability actually sounds like during this specific window, because language matters considerably in distinguishing authentic reflection from performed urgency. Genuine accountability tends to include specific acknowledgement of particular patterns, named clearly and without excessive self-flagellation, that shifts focus back onto managing the avoidance guilt rather than addressing the actual harm caused. Panic-driven reaction, by contrast, often relies more heavily on general statements of feeling, declarations of love or fear of loss that, however sincerely felt in the moment, don't actually engage with the specific behavioral patterns that produce the exhaustion in the first place. Listening carefully for this distinction, specificity versus generality, behavioral acknowledgement versus emotional declaration, can help clarify what's actually being offered during this critical window. There's something worth exploring, finally, about how this entire dynamic connects to a broader question about self-worth that extends well beyond any single relationship, because the experience of finally reaching exhaustion after prolonged effort often surfaces deeper questions about why so much patience was extended in the first place. Questions worth sitting with honestly, rather than rushing past in the urgency of the current moment. For some, this exhaustion reveals a pattern of consistently extending more patience than a given relationship has earned, a pattern worth examining independent of how this specific situation eventually resolves. For others, the exhaustion simply reflects an honest, reasonable response to a genuinely difficult partner without any broader pattern requiring further examination. Distinguishing between these possibilities, understanding whether the exhaustion reflects something specific to this relationship or something broader about one's own relationship to boundaries and self-advocacy, often provides valuable clarity regardless of what happens with the current avoidant partner specifically. It's worth examining too how mutual friends and family members often respond to this specific moment, because their reactions can inadvertently complicate an already difficult period of assessment. Well-meaning friends, having witnessed months or years of one partner's frustration, sometimes celebrate the avoidant's sudden change too enthusiastically, encouraging reconciliation before there's been sufficient time to determine whether the change is genuine or simply reactive. This external pressure, however kindly intended, can push someone back into a relationship dynamic before they've had adequate space to trust their own assessment of what's actually happening. It's worth remembering that outside observers, however caring, rarely have full access to the specific history of broken promises or temporary changes that may have already played out privately within the relationship, and their optimism, while understandable, shouldn't override the more informed judgment of the person who has actually lived through the pattern being described. There's a particular complication worth naming when children are involved in this dynamic, because the pressure to interpret an avoidant partner's sudden engagement charitably often intensifies considerably once shared parenting responsibilities enter the picture. A parent reaching genuine exhaustion after prolonged effort to reach an avoidant co-parent faces an additional layer of complexity that childless relationships don't carry: the practical and emotional weight of considering how any decision affects children who depend on both parents remaining reasonably functional and cooperative. This added complexity doesn't change the underlying psychological dynamics being described throughout this exploration, but it does mean the timeline for evaluation and the stakes attached to getting that evaluation right often feel considerably heavier, worth acknowledging honestly rather than pretending every situation carries identical simplicity. It's worth exploring as well how this specific moment of recognized exhaustion sometimes triggers something unexpected in the avoidant beyond simple panic: a genuine, if delayed, confrontation with their own mortality and the finite nature of relationships generally. Watching someone they've taken for granted finally reach a limit sometimes forces an avoidant to consider, perhaps for the first time in any real depth, that people in relationships don't remain available indefinitely, regardless of how they're treated, that patience has natural limits even when it's been extended generously and repeatedly over considerable time. This recognition, when it genuinely takes hold rather than remaining a fleeting, anxious thought quickly buried again, can sometimes catalyze more durable change than anything a partner's direct communication managed to produce throughout the relationship, precisely because it forces a confrontation with impermanence that words alone rarely manage to create as effectively. There's something worth naming about the specific role vulnerability plays once an avoidant partner reaches this point of genuine confrontation with loss, because true accountability during this window often requires a level of exposure that feels, to the avoidant, uniquely uncomfortable compared to their usual patterns of managing conflict. Admitting genuine fear of loss, rather than simply performing renewed affection or urgency, requires acknowledging a level of dependency the avoidant has likely spent years working hard to avoid ever revealing, even to themselves. When this deeper vulnerability does surface authentically, it often carries a different quality than the avoidant's usual communication style, less polished, less immediately reassuring, sometimes even somewhat halting or awkward as they attempt to articulate something they've never had practice expressing clearly before. This awkwardness, counterintuitively, can actually serve as a more reliable signal of genuine reckoning than smooth, well-articulated reassurance would, precisely because genuine vulnerability rarely arrives polished on the first attempt. It's worth considering, finally, how the listener's own healing and self-trust factor into this entire evaluation process, because the capacity to accurately assess whether an avoidant partner's response represents genuine change often depends significantly on the listener's own emotional state during this critical window. Someone still deeply activated by the fear of losing the relationship altogether may struggle to evaluate the avoidance response with full clarity, prone to interpreting ambiguous signals more charitably than the evidence actually warrants, simply because the alternative, genuinely accepting that the relationship may be over, feels too painful to fully sit with in the moment. This isn't a criticism of anyone navigating this difficulty. It's simply an honest acknowledgement that clear assessment often requires some degree of internal stability first, sometimes achieved only through deliberately creating space and distance rather than remaining constantly available for whatever the avoidant chooses to offer next. For the listener currently sitting inside this exact moment, watching an avoidant partner respond with unusual presence to a level of withdrawal that finally registered as serious, there's something worth holding on to, regardless of how the situation ultimately unfolds from here. The exhaustion itself was never a mistake, never evidence of insufficient patience or inadequate love. It was the honest, natural result of sustained effort, meeting a pattern that consistently failed to meet it halfway. And whatever happens next, whether it produces genuine, lasting change or simply another cycle of temporary reassurance, the exhaustion that prompted this moment deserves to be trusted as real, valid information rather than something to feel guilty for having finally reached. There's a final consideration worth naming here, one that genuinely applies regardless of which specific direction the current relationship ultimately ends up taking from here. Learning to recognize the genuine difference between panic and honest reckoning, between fleeting temporary reassurance and truly lasting change, is a skill that extends well beyond this single relationship, one that tends to genuinely serve the listener well in every single future connection where similar dynamics might eventually resurface. This particular moment of exhaustion, however deeply painful it felt to have finally arrived at, offers an unusually clear and revealing window into how a specific person handles the genuine possibility of loss, information that proves genuinely valuable, whether the relationship ultimately continues onward, transforms into something considerably healthier, or comes to a full, complete, and truly permanently final end. Trusting what that window reveals, rather than talking oneself out of what was clearly observed simply because renewed engagement feels temporarily reassuring, tends to serve long-term well-being considerably better than optimism untethered from actual evidence. What remains true throughout every version of how this moment might unfold is that reaching genuine exhaustion, however uncomfortable it felt to arrive at, and however uncertain the path forward from here may still seem, was never something to apologize for. It was simply honesty, finally spoken through action rather than words, after words alone had already been given every reasonable chance to work. That honesty doesn't require an audience to justify it. Doesn't require the avoidant's eventual response to validate its legitimacy, and doesn't require anyone else's permission or approval in order to be fully believed and trusted. It stands on its own, quietly and completely, exactly as valid and true on the specific day it first arrived as it genuinely remains today, regardless of whatever eventually comes next in this particular story.